to a large degree, we are all in this together. No person is an island. Doesn't matter how smart you are. Doesn't even matter how much money you've earned until now. You can't actually have a fully successful life if it's just you.
Hi, humans! Welcome to Demystifying Science, your go-to source for an off-world perspective on earthly affairs.
Today, we met up with strategist and activist Dr. Jim Pugh, a director at the Universal Income Project.
Dr. Pugh is a proponent of universal basic income, UBI, the idea that everyone has a right to the basic costs of living, food, health, and shelter.
Until very recently, this perspective hadn't been very popular in the United States. Before 2016, most people hadn't even heard of it.
That changed during the pandemic this year, when the government sent out a $1,200 stimulus to most of those earning less than $75,000 a year.
Despite this momentary shift, it seems the stubborn narrative of poverty remains in the United States, that UBI will somehow make people lazy.
Jim Pugh disagrees for some very good reasons that he lays out during our conversation. But he goes even farther, and he says that the abolition of abject poverty is the metric by which we should evaluate the health of a society.
And UBI would be a really great way to accomplish that.
In support of UBI in the US, he points at several experiments around the world that have shown tremendous promise in terms of advancing local economies and curbing suffering.
Instead of the catastrophic changes UBI opponents predict, these pilot programs actually show a much more modest change. The vast majority of people continued working at their old jobs.
And a modest fraction of them actually took advantage of the extra time they had to improve their skill sets, to dedicate themselves more fully to non-paid social work, like raising a family or taking care of elderly relatives.
Our conversation took a look at various concerns often raised by skeptics of UBI, like who pays for it?
Would it promote laziness?
Or is there a risk of inflation?
And beyond these questions, we also tried to get a better understanding of the actual hurdles faced by widespread implementation of UBI. There's political entrenchment via the two-party system, organization of the legislature, and some of the pros and cons of term limits.
Dr. Pugh also explains how you can take control of your local politics right now and steer the democratic machinery yourself.
Overall, it was a really informative perspective, and we'll be curious if the Americans can pull off what has played out with so much promise around the world.
Take care, humans, and as always, keep the conversations lined up with a like and subscribe. It's a huge help.
Enjoy the conversation with Dr. Jim Pugh of the Universal Income Project, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.
Well, hello.
Hello there.
So I hear that you, Dr. Jim Pugh, are an activist for universal basic income.
That is correct, I am.
What does that look like?
So a universal basic income is the idea that in society today, given how much wealth we have, that we should guarantee everyone as a right a monthly income that is sufficient to meet your basic needs. And so it is a guarantee that there is going to be this universal income floor so that in no situation could anyone ever fall into absolute poverty.
Is there a lot of support for that idea right now?
You know, a few years back, there was not. In fact, most people had not even heard of it. But over the last couple of years, the idea has been getting out there. More people have gotten interested in it. And at this point, if you look at some of the recent polls that have come out, it does seem as though a majority of people now want this for our society.
What's changed?
I think a number of things have changed. I think that if you look at just the trends over the last few years, it's become more evident to people that the way that our society and our system and our social contract provide people with support is just leaving too many people behind. That people recognize that how financially precarious that folks have ended up is a situation that just really doesn't make sense and is we don't need. And I think if you look just at the past few months with the pandemic that's happening right now, that it's become even more evident how really fragile a lot of our existing systems are, and that having just firm financial foundation of everyone getting that monthly check they could always depend on could really make a difference as far as people's ability to feel secure and do well.
So there was one check that went out to the American public, right?
Was that
There was
UBI?
It seemed like that was perhaps, yeah, that was perhaps a chance for that to continue, but it didn't happen.
I would say the fact that there was giving people this cash and recognizing the power that can come with empowering people with cash, that was a good thing. But particularly given everything that's going on right now, it wasn't nearly enough. And I think that's something that most people recognize. They saw how valuable and important that payment was, but also at the same time that there needed to be more, both a larger amount and also more consistency. That there's only so far that one check will get you, particularly in this crisis moment. And so if instead we had something coming in every single month that you could count on, that would really be much, much better.
Now, are there any concerns that this would lead to some devaluation of the currency?
That's a common question people have. As far as both the economics and the actual evidence around it, there really doesn't seem to suggest that that would be a big concern. If you, on the economic side, if you think about what causes inflation, it's really when you have a system where you don't have that matchup between supply and demand, and so prices get out of control. But even if you were to give everyone money every month, if our markets continue to function, if there is supply and demand and competition, then that's actually going to really keep the price down. An example I like to give is if you think about, all right, everyone starts getting these checks, and then McDonald's says, all right, we're going to double the price of our food. Well, then down the street, Burger King says, well, we want to make more money, but we can still make more money, and we're only going to increase our prices by 50%. And then across the street, Pizza Hut's like, well, we'll just increase it by 25%. And that competition keeps that price where it started, really. And so there isn't an economic rationale as to why you would see a lot of inflation. And this is also borne out by the different experiments and pilot programs that have been run in countries around the world, that when they've done these big experiments, they've looked to see, all right, what happens in the economy? Do prices go up? And they don't by any significant amount. There was experiments in Mexico, there was experiments in Kenya where they were exploring this and they just didn't see it. And so I think that I think there are reasonable concerns that if you suddenly push out a ton of money all of a sudden, what may happen and that people may try to take advantage of it. There may be predatory behavior. And so I think that thinking about how do we also make sure when we do this that we put some safeguards in place. So let's say that you create some anti-gouging laws around rent, just like California actually did this just last year, that it says you can only raise rent by a certain percentage every year. You have things like that in place, it means the initial shock of the payments aren't going to cause everything to get out of whack. But over the long term, there really isn't any evidence to suggest that we see a lot of inflation.
When these experiments have been done, were they done on an entire country or were they done on just a subset of people?
So no one has done an entire country, a full UBI in an entire country. The closest that we have right now is the state of Alaska in the US, which has been receiving an annual check, which comes from money that was obtained from oil in the state that was invested. And the returns on that get paid out to every Alaskan
How
every
much
year.
do they get?
It depends on the year, but generally between $1,000 and $2,500. So
Wow.
not enough to live on, but particularly if you say you have a family of four, you could be talking upwards of $8,000, $10,000, which is a fair amount of money.
Oh, so it's for
And so,
kids too.
yep. absolutely everyone.
Huh.
And so that's something where they've looked at, all right, has this caused prices to get out of whack, things like that? No evidence to suggest that. And then more recently, and again, not a full country, but there's been this really, really big experiment that's been happening in Kenya where the organization Give Directly has been actually taking entire villages and providing them with UBI. These villages tend to be fairly self-contained, they're their own community. And so you start to see what would happen if we were to have an entire society that had a UBI,
And what does that
and they've
look
been
like?
able it looks like people being more financially secure, more food secure, people having more opportunities to get ahead economically, the
Hmm.
money to actually be able to develop their businesses or find better work. And again, not any sort of big jumps in prices. It's something people do better, and it doesn't really put anything out of whack in the economy.
Now, are the major pushbacks essentially moralistic? In other words, are people concerned that this will breed laziness or
Well, there's got to also be a thing about where does the money come from, right?
who pays for it?
Yeah.
Those are all questions that definitely come up when talking to people about this. I think there's definitely some moral reservations that people have because it's become so ingrained in the modern psyche in the US in particular that, oh, you have to work to get ahead and that you don't get anything for nothing. And so the idea of saying, oh, just everyone is going to get this money every month is very counter to how people think about the way things work a lot of the time. And it's a challenge to get past that initial reservation to actually talk about, well, what does this actually mean? Is this actually bad, or does this mean that all of us are going to end up doing better?
Well,
So
that's really an interesting criticism coming from a traditionally Christian country,
What do you
don't you
mean?
think? I mean, that Christian religion seems like it's based on ideas of charity and generosity.
Hmm. But only
I
to those
think
who deserve it, right?
I don't think so.
Just everybody?
I think even bad guys get charity in the Christian religion. I haven't read the Bible in a few thousand years, but
What do you say, Dr. Pugh?
I think it depends on your interpretation of Christianity, because there's certainly some things in the Bible that would support something like a universal basic income, and at the same time, there's the puritanical work ethic that is part of the foundation of the U.S., which is the idea you should always be working hard, and so I think that often gets tied together with people this idea of deservedness, that if you're not behaving in this certain way, do you really deserve to survive? And so that has led to, I would say, a lot of policy choices over the years and decades
that's
that
very
have made,
Darwinistic.
yeah, in a lot of ways.
Well, I was going to ask because animals all work all the time, not necessarily for money, right? I don't know that squirrels are storing away dollar bills, but they have to work all summer long in order to be able to survive the winter. So it seems like the work ethic goes maybe even deeper than this. You said it was the puritanical aspect, but it must go back even farther than that. Has there been a historical push for universal basic income ever on the planet?
There actually has, depending on how you look at it, even going back millennia, there have been talks about this sort of thing in old Islamic societies.
Hmm.
In Greece, the idea came up that everyone should get something unconditionally because of these shared resources, maybe not at the level of being able to survive, but that idea that there is this collective wealth that everyone ought to be partaking in is certainly an old idea. You'll often hear talk about Thomas Paine, one of the founding fathers of the US, discussing this in his book, Common Sense. He did talk about the idea that everyone should be getting this base amount, which was at or near a level that you could live on just unconditionally because of the shared resources around us. And
Everyone?
so,
He included women and non
well,
landowners and slaves and children, everybody?
I don't think he went into too many details as to who
Hmm.
he actually meant when he said everyone.
Fair.
And knowing the time, that I could imagine there was certain of those groups that might not have been included if that had actually turned into a policy. But I think I would say broadly, the concept that people should be receiving this unconditional amount is something that's come up many, many times in history.
And it seems like this isn't about not working necessarily,
I
because,
think
yeah, go ahead.
that's exactly right. That it's oftentimes when you say this, people jump to the conclusion that, oh, that means then you're encouraging or basically saying people don't want to work or be productive. But I think a key thing to recognize is there's a big difference between productive contribution and what we think of as just a job today, which I would say, and it can go both ways. There's both a lot of work happening that is incredibly important, like taking care of family members, like getting education, like all sorts of community service work in its various forms. And at the same time, there's a jobs that exist today, sometimes that people get paid a lot of money for, that aren't actually making our society better. And so part of the idea behind universal basic income is that we could potentially start to decouple this notion that paid work is the only sort of valuable work and have a bigger collective conversation and recognition that there are many, many ways to contribute to society and that we can think about how do we better engage in that sort of activity separate from just allows us to bring home a paycheck.
So where does that money come from, though? It's a beautiful idea. The fact that humans are working all the time, they're taking care of things that need to be taken care of, but not really getting support for it. You hear about this in terms of, you said taking care of relatives, but women's work in general, housework, making sure that things run behind the scenes. If the home was viewed as this economic place, then the person who's basically producing the home would be given full credit and would be given some kind of income. So it makes a lot of sense for humans, but that's a lot of money. And you guys printed a bunch of money just recently. You just print money.
Yeah, what's the future of money?
Well, that's a whole other conversation.
There's a lot of questions here.
Um, but I think there's two things that it's important to talk about around the question of how do you pay for it. The first is just asking, do we have enough resources for this to work? Because if we don't, then the idea doesn't make sense. But looking at a country like the United States, as of right now, the amount of food that the US produces is enough to feed everyone in the country twice over. There are, if you look at people who don't have housing right now, there
What's
are
becoming of that food, by the way? That's why
uh,
sober.
some of it's getting sold to other places, some of it is getting thrown away, um, and some of it is being stored. And I don't honestly know what all that breakdown looks like,
Mm-hmm.
but in the U.S. we produce far, far more food than we actually need. And thinking about shelter, if you look at everyone in the country that doesn't have housing right now, and if you look at how many vacant houses there are, it's between 4 and 8 vacant houses to every one person without shelter.
Wow.
So just recognizing, thinking of it in broad terms, do we have enough to provide for basic needs? The answer is yes. So then the second question is, how do you actually make that work economically? And there's different ideas out there around that. I mentioned Alaska as potentially the closest thing that we have right now to universal basic income. They took money from oil, invested it, and now it's those investments that pay back. That's something that you could think about replicating at the national level, where instead of oil, you might take corporate equity. And so every company that is operating, a certain percentage of the stocks for that company could be put in this social wealth fund. And that investment could grow over time, as we see with the stock market and other sorts of equity investments. And then the returns on that get paid out to everyone. And that on its own could get people a good chunk of a full universal basic income. And so that would be a way that's completely separate from taxes that you could do a lot of this.
But it's a form of taxation on corporations to take their wealth and redistribute it.
I mean, it depends on how you look at it. It would still be equity. And so, more commonly, I mean, when you have someone work for a company and they get shares in that company, you don't generally say the company's being taxed. You say that it's a form of wealth sharing. But it's a question of how you want to label it.
But generally,
But
people, I think, don't sell those shares, right? They hold on to them in perpetuity almost, as long as they believe that the company is going to do well. Or are they selling them?
I mean, once they get the shares, once the company goes public, then it's up to them.
Huh.
Some share them, some keep them in. And similarly with this fund, it wouldn't be something where as soon as you got the equity, you immediately cashed it in. You would actually keep money invested. And depending on all sorts of financial choices, the managers of the fund would decide, does it make sense to keep the money here or move it somewhere else? So that could be part of this. I think another way that you can help to cover the cost is something called a transfer repayment tax, where people are getting these checks every month. If you're earning money on top of that, as many people would be, then you pay a percentage of that money you earn beyond that, up until you pay back most of that transfer. So what that means is that for those folks who aren't earning as much for whatever reason, they would be getting full amounts. And then if you are earning more, gradually you would be paying that back. And that ends up making the whole program far less expensive
Mm-hmm.
than it initially seems when you talk about giving money to everyone. And then beyond that, I think there's ideas around something like a wealth tax, something where you can look at these various places that wealth is being concentrated in society today and say a portion of that should be going into covering the costs of a program like that. So when you bring things like that together, you can pretty easily be able to get enough funds to be able to make a program like universal basic income work.
So it seems like there's this phenomena that happens where as humans move into the higher earning brackets, they demonstrate, actually, it seems like, correct me if I'm wrong, but less generosity and charity. And they sort of develop this idea that they pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps. Like, they sort of forget all the fortunate little sparks of luck that happened along the way and the people that helped them out and maybe that check that they got from the government once upon a time. How do you appeal to someone who's moved into that next level of success? Because obviously you'll need their support with this basic income project since they'll be paying for it essentially. How do you have those conversations productively?
Yeah. I mean, I think it depends. It depends on the person. It depends on the moment. I think that in general, and I would say this is particularly true in crisis moments, that you can start to remind people that to a large degree, we are all in this together, that no person is an island, and that just you on your own, doesn't matter how smart you are, it doesn't even matter how much money you've earned till now, that you can't actually have a fully successful life if it's just you. And that at some level, it is about collective efforts. Certainly, as far as how people got their fortunes in the first place, the amount we rely on at the very least, the technological infrastructure and as well as the physical infrastructure that has been built up over the decades that enables society as it exists today to function. Those were collective efforts, and that is what allows us to do what we do today. And so, certainly, I would say there's a justification for the fortunes people have coming from that. But I think there also, you can say in these crisis moments going forward, that if we don't figure out ways to actually support people at large, that there isn't a way for a liberal society, not necessarily in the political sense, but in the way we function sense, to be able to exist going forward. And so, if that's something that you value, you need to take a step back and think about what part are you going to play in making that happen. And that may mean that you're sharing more of your wealth than exists today. And I
But
would say,
ostensibly, there's people that would be perfectly happy to be very, very rich, while there's lots of people that are very, very poor. The argument that the society couldn't continue without this sort of universal income probably wouldn't sway those people, right? Do you encounter a lot of people that have that perspective of it's fine the way that it is?
I have talked to very few people who think it's fine the way that it is,
Oh, that's
frankly.
good.
Yeah, I think that with particularly with the crises we're facing right now, that there is very broad recognition that the way things are right now is not good.
Does
And
it seem
so
like the crisis of right now is shifting political will? Because it seems like there's so many people on America seems very distraught right now, according to their political perspectives. But on either side, people are economically,
You mean it's really fractured, really
yeah,
polarized?
yeah, exactly. But people on either side seem like they're equally damaged by this. Does it seem like it's shifting political will right now?
I would say shifting political will and shifting political power, because I think there is definitely polarization and split broadly of people across the country, as far as their idea of what's the right way to move forward. But I think there's also a big split of those in power and those not. And that right now you have a lot of people in power who are really clinging hard to a status quo mentality and the idea that somehow we can go back to operating the way things were before,
Hmm.
which makes sense because that's the system that got them into power. That's the system that they have felt comfortable in. And despite mounting evidence to the contrary that that's not sustainable, it's really hard for them to let go. But I think that doesn't necessarily, in spite of perhaps hearing representatives of different sides speaking for them, that there's a lot of people out there who would be very, very happy to embrace something that looks very different, if they felt like it could better support them. It's only a question of are their voices able to actually move where things happen. And so I think that's where the power aspect, and to some degree, this is semantics, political will, power, but having that perspective, I would say it's the clear majority perspective, be able to actually reach the level of the decision making of our country.
Has anyone thought to tax the tech companies this, or not even tax, but to derive the universal basic income funds from the tech companies that everybody uses the way that they do in Alaska from the oil companies?
That has certainly been there have been a lot of discussions around that. People have had different ideas for how that could work, whether it's more traditional corporate taxation, whether it's a taxation on when people are paying for advertising, that some of that money would go into that. But at the end of the day, that's also the what I mentioned earlier with the social wealth fund, taking corporate equity. That's basically what that aims to do. And I would say perhaps even more directly, because what that means then is if you have the equity, you have a shared investment with the corporate success. If the company does well, society ends up doing well. If it doesn't, it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really tying the fates together in a way that isn't nearly as true now, with the way that our corporate system works. That the fact that we've seen such a disconnect in recent decades between corporate success, corporate wealth generation, and the well-being of society at large, that this could help to recouple those fates.
It really makes me wonder. Well, let me back that up. So, we've been reading a lot about the space mining industry right now, which isn't really an industry on Earth yet, but there are promises of the first trillionaires being minted by this industry. It really makes me wonder if, Quinn was talking about a private company subsidizing this idea. You could really see the rebirth of monarchs if they were supporting an entire population privately. That's a pretty wild idea.
Yeah, what prevents King Zuckerberg?
I think that's a great question. I think that gets back to the power question, because beyond the question of do people have enough to survive, there's also the question of how much control do people have in our society. And the more we move to a system that starts to look like a monarchy, whether extensively or implicitly, or whether explicitly or implicitly, the more that you can start to question how much power do individuals actually hold. And so I think there's a lot to dig into around that. And I think that if you, like me, don't think that we ought to have new forms of monarchy and that we should have the individual people be empowered in society, then there's a lot of areas, both in economics and outside, that need to be addressed to stop that shift from continuing. But I would say, as it relates to universal basic income, that can be a piece of that, because as right now, there's a lot of people who have less freedom because of their financial situation. When you're in a very financially precarious spot, you don't actually have the full ability to make decisions on your own because you're dependent on your finances. And so sometimes that means you're trapped in a job that is not treating you well, either not paying you enough, or there could be various other abuses going on. But if you are dependent on that employer for your paycheck and you don't see another option, you really don't have a choice there. Similarly, I think you can see that occurring in different relationships. If one person is dependent on their spouse for finances, they're then dependent. And so if things are not going well there for whatever reason, they may not feel like they have the option to leave. And so UBI would be a piece of empowering people to better be able to actually voice what they believe and make the decisions that they want to be making, which I think it's going to be a key part in how we maintain a society where people actually have a say.
Well, there's a really big shift coming to human societies that makes this even more urgent, which is this. You guys are kind of figuring out robotics and automation, and it seems like there's suddenly going to be a situation where there's a lot more employees than there are jobs.
I think
Didn't you used to
this is
study
actually,
robotics, by the way?
I did. I would say my previous career life, I was studying robotics. And this was actually one of the main things that got me interested in universal basic income in the first place.
You were like, what is coming?
I mean, yeah, so many aspects of that. But I think with this idea of automation replacing those jobs, I think it's something that I think there's a lot of questions around it. I think no one knows exactly what's going to happen or how quickly. But at the very least, we can be confident that it is going to be a hugely disruptive force. And when events like that have happened in the past, yes, we have created new jobs afterwards, but a lot of people have been hurt in the process. And so, if for this transition that's coming economically and on so many levels, if we actually want to support people, if we don't want people to suffer, then that's all the more reason to look at something like a universal basic income, so that you do have that guaranteed floor that no matter what happens, people will be able to cover those basic needs and have that basic level of freedom to be able to operate and navigate effectively in this changing economic societal situation.
So you frame that in terms of suffering, which I think is really at the heart of matters. But for someone who's just interested in their own success, how do you frame the argument? Because I think I've listened to you talk about this before, where it really does work out for the business sector at the end of the day. They have more money to spend on products, things like that. Are there other incentive structures that you can imagine for businesses to appreciate this idea?
I mean, I think there's actually a very strong business case for universal basic income mainly because of this economic stimulative effect, that there have been a number of studies that have found that one of the most effective forms of economic stimulus to boost the economy is to give people money. And so when you talk about a program where you have everyone getting enough money to cover basic needs, that's injecting a huge amount of money. And depending on where it's coming from, it may look different, whether it's something where you're spending from a deficit or whether you're doing it through a form of taxation. Whatever way it is, that's the people are going to be spending that money, and that's going to be driving businesses. And I would say, in particular, I think that it's areas of the country that are struggling economically. It's likely to have even more impact there because, let's say, you have an area where generally very low incomes, people aren't earning that much. The relative impact of everyone getting, say, $1,000 a month in an area like that, as compared to a big city where incomes are higher, it's going to be that impact is going to be much, much higher in the lower income areas. And so it's something that can really revitalize local economies. And so small businesses in particular, I would say, there's a very strong argument this can help to allow much more innovation and entrepreneurship in that area, which is really important because something I think oftentimes people don't realize is that we've seen over the last 10 years a pretty substantial decrease in entrepreneurship. There's this
Hmm.
idea that the US is incredibly innovative right now. You hear stories about places like in Silicon Valley, all these startups. But looking at the number of small businesses being created, it's actually considerably lower now than it has been in the past. And so something that can help to
Where has
stimulate
that
more of that.
decrease come from?
Where's the knee? Like around the 2000s or
When did it start dipping? Is your
yeah.
question? I don't actually know the exact date on that. I know in the last 10 years it's been going down, but I don't know if there was a certain moment when you could really see that dip.
And I'm curious
Uh,
about so it does seem like there's a lot of tech companies that are being made. Is the lack of entrepreneurship coming from actual hard goods and that kind of entrepreneurship, or where's that falling out of?
I think that is certainly that's a lot of people have had that perception that there's been a lot of innovation in the digital space, much less in the real world space. And that oftentimes the sorts of problems that people are aiming to solve are the ones that are easy to solve digitally. And
Hmm.
so some of the tougher ones get overlooked and ignored. And that may be part of it. I think there's, in my opinion, a very strong reason to believe that some of the other factors are the growth of monopoly power and the fact that you have certain sectors where you have very, very few companies that are dominating and really creating barriers to entry for new folks who might want to come in there through like protectionism models, through acquisition models, where as soon as someone starts to come up that seems like they might be a threat, they get gobbled up by a bigger company.
Mm.
And so that approach means that you don't actually have this thriving free market system that encourages and allows for innovation in the same way that it used to. So I think there's a lot of factors, but I think certainly something that would help a lot is if you could guarantee that anyone who wanted to start a business had a baseline amount of funds so that they would be able to, at the very least, pay for their own needs as they were starting to go through that process. That if you had that, you could expect to see more people engaging in that. And so, like I would say with many things, it's not something that a UBI on its own would necessarily solve completely, but a UBI could be a very, very important part of recreating a very innovative entrepreneurial ecosystem.
I love that you say ecosystem. We were just talking with a marine biologist who studies coral reefs, and he was talking about setting up these protected zones and how quickly they regrew. And interestingly, I think he works in Fiji.
Fiji.
Fiji. This is Dr. Mark Hay at Georgia Tech. He was telling us that the indigenous populations there have been doing this for quite some time, where they'll mark off certain areas and allow them to regrow. And so it's interesting to really think about treating our economy and our society
All
as
right.
an ecological system.
Well, Alphaflacians have been treating it as an ecology for a long time, but humans seem not quite to be on that same tick. Is there a set? 'Cause I've read before that there used to be these periods of equilibration in human society where debts would be erased, and there would be these. I think I read somewhere that either the ancient Greeks or the ancient Romans would have these days where they invert roles, and the poor could openly mock the rich, and the rich would have to take care of the poor. Just it's for a day, but it was a valve of some kind. But it seems like in modern day earthling situations, that's not really the case.
Well, one thing that I think you may have been alluding to is the idea of jubilee, which is
Mm.
debt forgiveness. And that's something that has existed biblically, but in the past, that you would say, if you look at these long-standing debts that people have accumulated, that they don't really have a path to pay off, that there would be this moment or day or period of forgiveness. And that is, I've seen some talk of that in modern times. It hasn't gotten a ton of traction so far, but it's one of those things where I would say society in its present day has this ingrained notion of this is the way things are. And so you took out a student loan, you got this expensive medical procedure, and so you figure out some way to deal with that. And in fact, everyone could then really end up being better off if we took a step back and said, well, actually, this really doesn't make sense now. Like let's wipe the slate clean on different fronts, and that the amount of human potential that could be unlocked by something like that could be immense. And so I think it is, again, one of those things where it's hard to get over this ingrained moralistic view that so many people have today to actually really look at what the situation is and to understand what are some of the solutions that you may see as incredibly unorthodox, but may really, really help the way things are.
It seems like in the United States right now, actually across the entire world, people are pretty unhappy with the way that democracy is structured. And you've been working in this role of advocate for some time, and I imagine that you've probably seen all of the broken pieces up close. If you could wave a wand and have it shift to be a better system tomorrow, what would that system look like?
I actually, for me, that's a very hard question to answer because one thing that I have recognized more and more through my advocacy work is it is important for me to maintain a large degree of humility around knowing what the answer is.
Hmm.
When I first started advocating for universal basic income, I wasn't 100% sure about the idea, but I felt like I had a sense of how society worked and could propose, okay, here's what we need. And as I talked to people in different situations about their views, it became pretty quickly apparent to me that there just how much I didn't know. And so even now, even after having spent years working on this, I still I now much more so remain cautious about saying this is what we need and this is going to solve everything. I think one of the things I like so much about UBI is the fact that when you give people cash, you are empowering them rather than saying, here's what you need to be successful. You're saying, here, here are the resources that will allow you to decide what you need to be successful. And so I see UBI as something important, an important piece of building a better society where everyone can really thrive. But at the same time, I know that there are so many parts of what that society ought to look like that I don't understand yet. And that I will only understand the more that we can start to move towards that and be able to see how people respond. And that it needs to be this ongoing iterative process where we continue to move in that direction, continue to observe, continue to make improvements, that is what's ultimately going to get us to that place. And so I guess if I could snap my fingers, I would say I want UBI, and I want us to move to a system where we adopt that sort of approach to our policymaking. And so we can continue to innovate as we move forward.
What concrete steps can be taken in policymaking to make sure that it's interested in progressing as opposed to stagnating?
I
Because
think
I've
that
read
it
that
is,
people on both sides of the political spectrum are absolutely unhappy with the government. This doesn't seem to be a left-right issue. People are just really frustrated. So, yeah, what can be done to help with that frustration? Because that stagnation seems like it has a lot to do with it.
yeah. I mean, I think a lot of different things. I think that the protests that are happening right now, people making their voices heard in the various ways that you have, whether that's protesting on the street, whether that's posting on social media, whether that is writing, calling to elected officials, that all helps. I think people who want to run for office, like that's great. Like we need
Mm-hmm.
more people with that mindset to be getting into those positions of power, and then also to supporting the other folks with that mindset who are doing the same thing. And so I think that is ultimately that's going to be our path there. That we need to make sure that the people with that perspective are in those positions to make these decisions.
How
And
difficult is it to be elected?
depends on what office you're running for. If you're running for
Hmm.
local office, it could be pretty easy. Oftentimes, you have positions that are sometimes uncontested locally.
Hmm.
The various commissions in your city or town, and running for things like your city council or maybe even your state legislature. That those it takes work. I mean, I don't want to downplay that, but it's something that is actually far more achievable than many people realize. And so, yeah, taking the steps to either do that, or if you have a friend who is out there and you feel would be a good fit, encouraging them to do something like that. That
Do
there
you,
is
I'm sorry.
opportunities. Yeah,
Yeah,
go ahead.
do you have any friends who have actually done this?
Yeah, I mean, I have been doing work in or near the political space for the last decade,
Hmm.
starting on the first Obama presidential campaign. And so, yeah, a number of my friends have run for office, a lot for state legislatures, some for federal Congress. So it's this is not something that will happen overnight, but it's the kind of thing where if you really want to be making a difference, then it's worth exploring something like that.
What do you think the best way for someone to start to explore that idea is? Just to start attending their local city council or
That
check
can
out
be
the school
great. Yeah,
board?
yeah. I think local, yeah, city or town council meetings, whatever sort of meetings are going on locally. There's groups, there's organizations that will help people who want to run for office.
Hmm.
Uh, yeah, and so there's different things out there that can help people who care about that sort of thing.
Now, what about politicians becoming entrenched in their positions? Because a lot of these seem like lifetime appointments, even though they're not specifically codified that way.
I mean, I think sometimes it's a double-edged sword because there's something to be said for experience and knowing how a system works. But I think particularly at the national level, we're seeing right now and have been seeing for some time that the sort of mentality around the status quo way of operating really seeps in, and it's hard to get around that, particularly when people are there for decades. And so I think it's an area where I don't know that there is like the one solution that will fix it. Some people will talk about term limits, but I think those can cut both ways. I would say at the least though, having elections where we ensure there is a way for people to challenge people who have been in office for a long time. And so looking at the primary elections that you've seen, I would say more and more of those happening in the last few years, where people who have been in office for a long amount of time get challenges and sometimes defeated by new people coming in with new ideas. That I would say is a healthy part of a functional democracy. And so if we start to see more of that, I think that not only does that on its own help to bring new people in, I think that the fact that that sort of thing does happen hopefully will also encourage other people who've been there for a while to keep an eye on and think about, am I actually representing the interests
Mm.
of the people that I ostensibly do represent?
Am I
And so,
relevant?
yeah. And so I think all that will help with this. But the other piece of it is, yeah, do we actually have people running? Going back to what we were just talking about.
Is there a sense that the two-party system is preventing some of this progress from happening?
I would say yes. Um, Unfortunately, I am not aware of any easy way for that to change within the United States because of the way that our system is designed,
Hmm.
that it really is prohibitive for a viable third party to exist. And so, unless and until the US were to switch to something like a parliamentary system, that's probably what we've got. But that said, I think you have seen in many ways successful organizing within the different parties to shift where they're at and what they're responsive to. And so I think that, at least for the immediate future, that's probably the way that things can start to shift.
Can you imagine the United States shifting to a parliamentary system?
I can imagine it, but I don't. It is, I would say, unfortunately, I mean, it would mean a major alteration to the Constitution, and so short of a complete rework of our government, which I don't see as terribly feasible in the
Well,
short or medium term.
now
Uh,
what are the main differences though? Just that there's coalitions that can vote, and it's not that big of a difference, is it really? Or I mean, the Constitution doesn't provide for parties, right?
If you had third parties that occupied some significant fraction of Congress, wouldn't you just almost have a parliamentary system?
so in a parliamentary system, you have parties come together to decide who will be the prime minister. And so that's in contrast to a presidential system where a president from a single party is elected. And because the executive office is equal in power, more or less, to Congress, effectively that means that you have outsized influence for a single party at the presidential level.
Mm-hmm.
So it would require shifting to something like a prime minister as a head of state for that really to work, which would mean something very different than what we have right now.
What if you elected three presidential candidates? Like three president, because you can't have just one person sitting on top deciding,
Well,
right?
you can't have a democracy with two people or one people.
Well, that's why I didn't say two. At first, I thought two, double it, but I think three might be the better option here.
I haven't thought about that. I think that I could imagine that would certainly help with having the limitations of a singular person. But I think as far as like, is three the right number? Like, do you end up with some sorts of power combinations that effectively mean that you're going back to something where you're unduly empowering a certain group of folks? I think it's hard for me to say without really thinking through that. But I mean, this stuff is tricky. That figuring out what are the systems that are really going to be resistant to abuse and corruption is hard to do, and takes a lot of work to think through and plan through, and actually try out in different ways to really know
Do you
what's the right
see
path.
any systems on Earth right now that are resistant to corruption in terms of governmental systems?
I mean, I think to greater or lesser degrees, I don't think you're ever going to have a system that is immune to that. And I think you always need to expect to take active measures to be pushing back against that. But I mean, I think just looking at what we were talking about, that a parliamentary system is more immune to that than something like a presidential system. Um,
Mm-hmm.
as at least insofar as corporate interests come into play, which is, I would say, in particular, where the U.S. has been suffering. as compared to a lot of other places in the past decades.
Mm-hmm. What do you think,
And so
Mickey?
if these changes did take place, they would need to take place at the congressional level?
You would need to have a new, at the very least, a new constitutional amendment, possibly a rewrite of the Constitution, which might require a new constitutional convention of all the states to
Wow.
come together. So that would be even beyond the congressional level,
Has
uh,
anything even close to that ever happened before?
not in modern history.
Wow.
So I suspect it would be far, far easier to pass something like a UBI than to make the sort of changes we're talking about.
What about moving beyond money? Is that on the table for humans?
I think it depends what you mean by money,
Okay.
because I think that there's certainly innovation in the way that we transact. But I mean, if you take a step back on money and decouple it from a lot of the institutions that exist around it right now, and just say this is a form. Uh, Basically, this is a mechanism that allows us to exchange without directly using goods and services. Um, I would guess not, just because there's a great degree of flexibility that you get with something like money. And so I think some form of that, I would be surprised if that went away. Um, but as far as innovation, say, around where that money comes from, how that money operates, certainly I would expect, I think there's already a lot of people trying out new things there, and I would expect that to continue.
But
And I think
there's the
particularly,
possibility it could be displaced by some sort of share economy too, perhaps.
Like everybody shares the money?
This gerontologist we were talking to at Albert Einstein School of Medicine was speaking about this share world economy that he imagined.
I mean, I think there's a difference between, I guess, partial displacement and full displacement. And so the idea that some of what is done purely financially now could be done in other ways, I think is completely right. Um, it would surprise me if there were a system that worked as well where you were abolishing money fully, just because again that there's flexibility that comes with that, and like many systems, there's potential for abuse. But I think that if you can approach it thoughtfully and carefully, then you can set up systems that can give you benefits without falling into the trap of some of the problems, many of the problems that we have today with it.
Nice.
What do you think is the most pressing? Accomplishing something requires writing down a list of what needs to be taken care of and then figuring out what to tackle first. What do you think is the most pressing problem that needs tackled right now?
That's, I would say, also a well.
This is just in your opinion, right? You're not
Yeah,
speaking for
yeah,
everyone. You're not saying that this must be.
totally. But I would say the most pressing issue is changing the narrative.
Hmm.
Because right now, a lot of the stuff we've been talking about, it's running up against these social narratives that are stopping us from making progress.
What are these narratives?
I think there's a narrative around deservedness that I mentioned
Hmm.
earlier, of that right now there's this perception of not everyone in society deserves to survive. Every time you have a politician say, no one who works 40 hours a week should live in poverty, the unstated, implicit message being communicated is that if you work less than 40 hours a week, it's okay that you live in poverty.
Huh.
And that's something that I think we need to change. We need to shift the mentality that no one should live in poverty. I think that there are, similarly to that, there's ideas of who is and isn't a real American. And so the sort of white nationalist and racist behavior that you're seeing right now amongst many people and amongst our president at the moment is something that needs to be addressed head on and actively worked to shift around that. And I think, again, what I alluded to earlier, this idea of that paid job is what gives people their worth. as opposed to productively contributing in the various ways, that's another harmful current narrative that needs to be shifted. And so I think that if those things can be changed, I think then that really paves the way to being able to make the policy changes that will actually give us the society we want.
I love that.
It seems like you've got your work cut out for you.
Just a bit.
Do you feel like you're effective at changing the narratives?
I think it's a long process, but yeah, I would say that from when I started this work a little over 5 years ago, I feel like I've already seen a shift, and it's a collective effort. This has come from many different places, both inside and outside of the universal basic income advocacy space. But I think I've seen that shift in that period, and I think that for those of us engaged in this work, continuing to push on that, I think that there's a lot more headway we can make.
Yeah, it sounds like good news.
Well, good luck. What projects do you have coming up right now?
What is going on right now? Well, this isn't something I'm so directly involved in. One that I'm excited about is there was Mayors for Guaranteed Income is an initiative that was launched just a couple months ago, where you have mayors from cities across the U.S. who are committing to run guaranteed income pilots in their cities. And so there's been a lot of different cities that signed on. Oakland, where I lived, has signed on. Los Angeles, St. Paul, Jackson, Mississippi, Chicago, Newark, New Jersey. And so I think that you're going to see in the near future a lot more basic income pilot programs.
Wow.
And those programs, beyond providing quantitative evidence around universal basic income, I would say those actually do a really great job in shifting the narrative because it humanizes the process, it allows people to see what actually happens when you give people who are struggling money to survive. And so the more that people become familiar with that and the positive outcomes of that, the more that that's going to whittle down that sort of moralistic resistance that we talked about earlier. And the easier it then becomes to talk about doing this at much larger scales. So very excited to see what moves forward with that. On my side, I've been doing work on some federal policy design that thinks about how basic income can really connect to racial wealth disparities and what sort of policies and programs can help us to really put people on more of a level playing field connected to basic income.
And does that project have a name?
Well, our policy that we released a couple months ago is called the Just Futures Fund.
The Just Futures Fund. We'll look at that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, we've taken a lot of your time. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Absolutely. Happy to chat with you.
I learned a lot.
Yep. Lots to look into. Thank you so much, Dr. Pugh.
Absolutely.
Bye.
Have a good one.
Bye.